This video is sponsored by Renderhub. Stick around to find out more about their brand new sexy robot contest and also an amazing place where you can find high quality 3D assets for your next project. So the folks at Blender have just announced and released Blender 5.2 LTS beta, and this comes with a ton of cool features that I believe a lot of creators and artists would love. Now the idea for the beta is for you to download Blender, test it out for bugs, and report those bugs before the final release of Blender 5.2 the LTS. And speaking about LTS, this means that Blender 5.2 will be part of the long-term support, as Blender 5.2 will be supported for the next 2 years. And this means that features that will be shipped to Blender 5.2 will be having continuous updates, bug fixes, and refinements for the next 2 years. And of course, if you'd like to grab this, all you need to do is go over to the link in the description that will bring you right here where you can download Blender. And so once you click on download, scroll all the way down, you'd find download Blender experimental. And once you click on that, you would notice right here that we have Blender 5.2 the beta for both Windows, Mac, and also Linux. And for those who like to read up on the release note and see some of the features that are coming with this, you can also go over to the release note where you'll be able to read up on the LTS release. This is currently in beta, and technically this means that 5.3 is automatically in alpha. Of course, there are little to no features for 5.3 as this has just made its way to alpha. But for 5.2, we do have a lot of impressive, cool features that I believe a lot of you guys will be super excited about. So with Blender 5.2 the beta opened up right here, let's take a look at some of the user interface stuff and then dive back into some very impressive features. First off, you'll notice that we've got a brand new splash screen. A huge shout out to Joanna for making this one possible. If you dive right inside of Blender, you notice that the viewport and the overall user interface looks nothing new. Underneath the hood, a lot of things are going on. So first off, you would notice that this now has background. In previous versions, this was not there, but now you have a background. If you work with cameras, for example, if we have this camera selected, and we press 0 on the keyboard to frame in base of that camera. If we go over to our camera section and switch this from perspective to orthographic, we now have a new scale tool or a new move tool that we can use to move the camera back and forth within the viewport. Another thing that you notice is we have some sort of scaling tool which you can use to scale in and scale out depending on how much we would like to move within our orthographic view inside of Blender as well. And with that said, if you also take a look at some of the icons, you would notice that some of these icons have been changed. From the annotation icon to the brush icons, you would notice few updates here and there. And if you work with a Mac, you would notice that there's now the new liquid glass application icon from Mac OS 26 and above. And this has 4 different modes that you can play with: default, black, mono, and also mono black. There's a new convenience operator that has been added to flip the X and Y render dimension. So depending on how or what you're trying to render, you can flip these back and forth and get some interesting result. And with 5.2, if you're saving a file with unsaved images, there's a new dialog box that now asks if the user wants to also save the modified images. At the same time, there is a new user preference that was added to allow specifying image saving behavior when saving a file with modified images. The brush pop over advanced section in various paint modes has been reorganized and turned into a collapsible sub-panel. For those who work with UVs, the UV grid overlay option are now visible in all image editor modes. And of course, there's a couple of stuff for EEVEe that we're going to talk about when we talk about modeling and EEVEe. And for node editors, the make group operator now avoids type conversion of inputs with multiple connections. And of course, this proceeds to avoid duplicate output socket. And when you simply ungroup, the ungroup operator itself now adds proxy input and converter nodes. And this is to ensure that the node behavior remains unchanged when ungrouping. There's a couple of editing options that are now available when you work with nodes. And this includes being able to work with multiple nodes, as these can be resized at the same time, being able to rename the nodes directly, and also being able to add dynamic sockets directly in the nodes. They've also updated the evaluation on text edit change in string input node, and this is pretty interesting. Within the outliner, there's the new scroll to active option to keep the view centered around the active object. And this makes it very easy for you to find stuff when you're dealing with the big scene. And if you're working with a preference within the theme editor, there's a small reorganization of color, textiles, and user interface panels for easier editing. And something else you'd notice is we have the asset libraries. Now this asset libraries is a pretty new one as this supports both local and online assets. If you simply press the plus sign here, you'll be able to remote to websites, or you can simply load up local asset libraries from here. More on this when we talk about assets. Something else which is also pretty interesting is within the modifiers, as we now have some new modifiers that deals with capture rest geometry, cloth dynamics, which is in experimental, collider, and hair dynamics. And for a quick demo before we talk about physics, how this one works is relatively this easy. So I'm just simply going to draw out the grid, subdivide this a couple of times, and we can simply move this all the way up. So with this, if we go over to our modifier and add the cloth dynamics, which is currently in experimental, we'll now be able to procedurally simulate clothes inside of Blender. At first, once you press the playback, nothing happens. So to get things going, what we need to do is to simply come through, press the tab key, make a selection. So we're just simply going to select the path that we'd like to pin. And once we have that selected, we would go over to where we have our object data, go over to vertex group, click on the plus sign to create a group, assign that, and we can simply go all the way back here within our modifier and make sure that we have this group selected. Now, if you change this to anything else, so for example, if we come here and set this to pin and press the enter key, if we go back to our modifier, we can now change this to pin. And once you have that, if you press the playback button one more time, you now see that we have some nice simulation going on. Go under the hood and take a look within the geometry nodes section. You will see we now have procedural clothing happening. To make this a collider is pretty simple. Make a quick bevel, roll in on that quick bevel, go all the way back, make this shaded smooth, bounce this back, have that selected, go to the modifier and assign a specific collider, not this collider. This is the new collider that you use for these ones. So once you have that there, we can now start doing stuff. For this one, how it works is a little bit different. Press M on the keyboard, create a new collection. And in this collection, I'm just going to call this collider. And once we have that done, once we have the cloth selected, we can go over to the effectors and select the collider collection. So once we have this there, if we press the playback button, you can now see some nice cloth simulation going on. Again, all of these you can simply control right here within your geometry node. One cool thing that is also available with this is once you have this selected, you can enable tear. So that is also a very cool feature. Also, let's turn that off. We can also increase the bendiness. If we press the playback button, you can see that we have more bendiness going on there. If we send this all the way back, reduce that, increase stretchiness, press the playback button, you can now see we have a much more stretchy, gooey kind of cloth simulation going on with this one. Of course, you can mix them both together depending on the kind of cloth that you're working with, and you can get some interesting looking result. Now, with that said, if you simply go over to the release notes, you'll be able to read more about the new cool features with Blender 5.2 LTS interface. And with that out of the way, let's dive into physics. There's now a new experimental geometry node-based physics system for both hair and cloth, and this means that you can now dynamically create clothes and control them right inside of Blender, as underneath the hood you will be able to control these by simply using geometry nodes. And for cloth, the new experimental cloth dynamics modifier and node groups can just be added to any mesh to give it that cloth-like behavior. This supports various features like the built-in pinning, stretchiness, bendiness control, and also tearing, making it easier for you to work dynamically right inside of Blender, either via the modifier or geometry nodes. And for the hair dynamics, this now has pretty much similar setup with what we already had with the typical hair. But the cool thing with this one is once you're done building your hair, you can easily add the hair dynamics modifier and have this animating. Of course, the dynamic modifier does have a few parameters that you can control or tweak to get amazing result, but for the most part, this is super impressive. Of course, there's also a full procedural setup that you can also do as well, making it easier for you to dial into the nodes and make some very interesting tweaks. This new physics tool also comes with effectors, as with the effectors, you can use this to impact the simulation of both the hair and the cloth groups. And the effector has colliders, which is really cool, as with the collider effect, you can use this to simulate collision on the mesh, and at the same time, these also ships with forces. So with the forces, you can also use this to create that sort of gravity feature, which might come in extremely handy if you're thinking about a simulation that will require some form of systems to drive the simulation in one direction or the other. Amongst these, we also have some custom effectors as well, which is also pretty cool. And custom effectors can be used to inject fully custom behaviors into the simulation by using closures. And that's not all. The physics section also features some nice cool filters. And with the filters, we can actually tag various geometries and create some form of simulation based off specific tags. And these alongside an effector can definitely simplify how creators get to work with this new physics tool. And while we speak about the brand new nodal physics, we also have the XPBD solver. And this is a built-in solver node that powers the clothes and hair dynamics. This is currently in experimental and does all the heavy lifting for solving various constraint types. Currently, this has two main approaches of customizing the simulation at a much more deeper level. And with the new experimental geometry node-based physics system for hair and clothes, creating dynamic hair and clothes which are powered by geometry nodes would give artists a more flexible and procedural way of working with clothes and hair in Blender. And while we speak about the new experimental geometry node tool, let's talk about geometry nodes itself. First off, we've got the geometry bundles. And bundles were introduced in Blender 5.0. Now it is possible to attach bundles to a geometry. And what this does is it simply allows the passing along arbitrary data with a geometry. And this happens across modifiers and object boundary. Right now we do have two major nodes that support this, which includes the set bundle and also the get bundle, as the set bundle node updates the bundle stored in the geometry, while the get bundle node retrieves the bundle of the geometry. At the same time, we're getting list, and list simply allows the storing of sequences of arbitrary lengths, for example numbers or strings in a node. And Blender 5.2 will be shipping with core nodes for dealing with lists. Right now, we do have about two of these lists, and one of them has to do with the field to list node that creates new lists with a given length by evaluating fields that may depend on the index node. The second list node has to do with the closure to list, as this creates new lists with a given length by evaluating a closure that has an index input. And of course, these lists can be accessed by the list length and also the get list item. We also have the filter list as well and the sort list. And for geometry node, list seems to be a big deal that will be coming to geometry node. At the same time, we're getting a collection children node, and this would allow creators to access the list of objects that are within a collection. I think this will be pretty useful in various cases. There's also a new sound sample frequency node, which is also going to be useful for those who work with sound, as you can get a single amplitude value for the entire sound at a given time, or you can simply sample the frequency ranges, which allows generating spectrum animation. And if you're into motion graphics, of course, this is going to be super useful. And we've got some other stuff that has to do with empty object, merging points, as the merge by distance node can now be built from more anatomic building blocks, giving more control over which points are merged exactly. We also have the mesh bevel, which is a pretty impressive node for those who like modeling with geometry node, as this provides detailed control over edge or vertex beveling. At the same time, we've got some new nodes for attributes, some new nodes for curves, and of course some new nodes for strings, nodal group inputs, and bundled assets. In all, Blender 5.2 is coming with a huge set of nodes for Blender users, so if you're into geometry nodes, you will definitely find this one interesting. And when we speak about nodes, let's talk about the Compositor. Blender 5.2 Compositor is getting some interesting nodes. And first off, we're looking at the file output node, which now has a file extension checkbox that is independent of the file extension checkbox in the scene render setting. Something else that's been added to the Compositor is the fact that the depth of grease pencil object is now reflected in the viewport Compositor depth pass. We also have a new blank image node that was added to return a new image of a given size and constant color. Node Gizmo now has a few supports. First off, they have support for auto keying, which is very interesting. So in case you're thinking about animation, this can now be done easily. At the same time, node gizmos are now supported in the image editor, and the view gizmo now follows the image display's offset. The Compositor now supports integer vector sockets, as they are now used instead of standard float vector sockets in the image coordinate node. Alongside this, we're also getting some nice Compositor nodes, from object nodes all the way to vector nodes, string nodes, rotations, and so on. Something else which is really interesting is that the node editor now shows the render region when the backdrop is enabled. And with that, you can also increase and reduce how much of the pass out is visible, as this comes with a nice cool slider that you can operate. There's also support for lazy evaluation of switch node whose condition is known statically, that is, not connected or connected directly to a group input socket. as the lazy evaluation means that nodes that are not needed are not executed to save execution time. We also have support for socket value inspection, and in terms of asset, Blender 5.2 now comes with film grain, which simulates the noise and behavior of analog films. We also have the 3D to screen space, which transforms 3D coordinates from world to normalized camera spaces. Amongst these are other interesting stuff, which includes support for default input types and so on. In terms of things that were changed, the interactive compositor is now significantly more responsive. At the same time, the interactive compositor now supports animation, and this makes sense because the node gizmo now supports animation playback. Alongside these, there are also various cool stuff that are now available for compositing. So if you're into compositing, then of course you will definitely love this one. And while we speak about the compositor, the video sequence editor is also having some updates, as compositor modifiers and effects within video sequence editor can now use GPU acceleration, and this is controlled in the same place as regular compositor execution devices, and you can make those changes by simply going over to render, performance, and compositor. At the same time, the compositor modifiers now support arbitrary inputs, which includes menus, input panels with panel toggles, and more. And if you're thinking about using the compositor modifier within your video sequence editor, the Compositor Modifier extra menu now has options to hide the node group data block selector. At the same time, the Compositor Node Tree asset shows up in the Node Tree asset menu. And speaking about modifiers, if you simply select any of your clips right here inside of Blender, and you go over to your modifiers, if you click on Add Modifier, you would now notice that down here we have more modifiers that are linked to your compositor. So basically, these modifiers are modifiers that should exist within your compositor, and it makes sense to see that you now have them here. One of them includes the film grain, which we just talked about, and you can see that film grain modifier right here, and we can actually go ahead and play with it and get working with it right inside of Blender. Now, this is something that is now available with Blender 5.1, and of course with 5.2 you can easily do stuff like animating these, having them right inside of your video sequence editor, and layering as many of these as possible. We'll get some cool updates in terms of the timeline and also the text strips, as text strips now supports adjusting line spacing in between separate lines. Text strips now support style presets, and these style presets can be used for both subtitles, main title, and corner titles. But that's not all. We're also having some updates in terms of the scene strips, as scene strips now have a view layer selector. Something else which is added to your scene strip now includes the option to override the workbench world settings, allowing the tweaking of background colors for all scene strips at once. We're also getting some cool strip modifiers for your video sequence editor, and in terms of scopes now support HDR and wide gamut color spaces, as HDR color spaces are plotted with a log scale and show grid lines in nits. The scopes also encompasses the full gamut of the display color space for P3 and Rec 2020. Clip colors are more clear due to padding around minimum and maximum. And for miscellaneous, we do have some interesting miscellaneous stuff as well, and we also have some updates in terms of performance, Python API, and compatibility. So if you work with Blender's video sequence editor, then of course you can actually come through and explore this one. One very interesting feature which is now available with Blender 5.2 is asset, as it is now super possible to register remotely hosted asset libraries, browse them right inside of Blender, download this asset as needed, whenever and however you want. By default, the essential asset library that comes with Blender have been extended with a number of online hosted assets, and to have access to this, you would need to actually allow internet connection within your preference window. With that said, the online asset libraries have also been done in such a way that you can also link various websites and use them. So instead of just working based off the assets that you've got on your PC, you can simply link these to websites like Polyheaven and various other websites that host Blender files, and directly have access to those files and download them right inside of Blender. And like we mentioned in a previous video, the folks at Blender Kit are already doing something like this. But having these inside of Blender as a default means of loading assets, rather than just having this asset resident on your computer, which would definitely take up space, is a welcomed idea. For Grease Pencil, we do have a couple of cool features. One of the cool features here has to do with Fill Tool. We did mention these when we talked about some of the nice projects that folks at Blender were working on, and it's quite interesting to see that it's here. For animation and rigging, we've got a couple of cool things going on. And one of them has to do with the copy constraint that has been added to the link/transfer data menu. Another interesting update here is the in-between tools, as well as the operators to create in-between have been updated to be usable in objects mode. For Graph Editor, there's a few updates to Graph Editor, there's a couple of updates to Playback, and more so, there are also some updates to the loop modes, and this includes the infinite, the stop at frame, the stop at end frame, stop at start frame, restore frame, and bounce. And for Sculpt, Paint, and Texture, we have some cool new tools. First off, there is the new Scene Project Brush. Now, this simply allows you to create the same similar effect that you have with your shrink wrap modifier, but in this case, this happens when you're sculpting, as it allows displacing the sculpted object vertex towards the surface of the other object in the scene. On the other hand, if you're simply working with Blender 5.2, you would notice that the brush now looks pretty different, especially when it comes to the icon. Down here, you'd also notice that we have a brand new brush here, which has to do with the charcoal paint. Right here as well, you would notice that we can now add object. So once you click on add object, you can now draw and add an object right here. So we can actually go ahead and select different kinds of object that we want and add them within our sculpting mode. Something else which is also pretty interesting is if you're working with Din Topo and you switch to your sculpt mode and go back to your Din Topo, this no longer asks you for confirmation. And still within sculpting, the color filter tool in the fill mode, which is this one right here, now uses the unified scene color to color any model. So in this case, if we would like to color this, all we need to do is click and drag on the active object, and if we like to invert the color, if we hold down Ctrl and simply click, automatically it inverts it. And you would actually notice this even more if we go ahead and change the color. So let's say we give this green, maybe a little bit more of that green, and then we change this to something maybe like red. If we click and drag, you notice that becomes green. If we hold down Ctrl and click, we can flip that out. Right here, we do have the icon to swap, but this looks more like a refresh icon as opposed to a swapping icon. And for modeling and UV, loop tools are now part of Blender. And how you work with this is pretty simple. In this case, if we like to convert any of these parts of our mesh to become circle, we can simply have a selection and go over to mesh, go to transform, and convert that to circle. At the same time, if we do have jagged edges or certain parts that we like to play with, we can go over to mesh, go over to transform, and we can either choose to flatten, wrap, randomize, and play with some of the features that exist with this one. At this point, these tools have not been added to the right click, which I believe is something that will be pretty useful in the long run. Some other cool features that you find with this includes space from the loop tool add-on is now also available as a native operator. They've also added support to snap into lattice objects, which again is pretty nice. And if you work with 3D text, there's now an improvement for combining characters. For mesh, selections now work through backface color faces, and for UV, there's a couple of nice cool additions that are here. So for modeling, we don't really have a lot of things going for it, but what we have is nice. For motion tracking, we have a tiny bit of updates. For pipeline and IO, we do have updates to both GLTF importer and exporter, USD, images, more specifically OpenEXR, movies, Alembic, and STL. For rendering, we have a few updates that deals with the render output, color, and shader nodes. So for render output, saving render outputs can now be disabled. And at the same time, you can now easily copy the light/shadow linking to a specific selection. And for color management, we do have a few things going on for it with the whole organization, and at the same time, we're getting new input color spaces for Apple, Arri, Blackmagic Design, Canon, and Sony cameras. There's a new color space for Adobe RGB, common gamma values, and white gamma textures. At the same time, we're getting a tiny bit of updates in terms of shader nodes. There's a specific one that is really good, and that has to do with the thin wall. Now, the thin wall just simply makes it extremely easy for you to see through objects, or you can simply change any geometry that has a material that the thin wall has turned on to a much more thinner object that you can see through. Now, what this means is instead of having that refraction or, having that distortion when you look through glass or stuff like that, this automatically uses the Boolean input called thin wall within your principal BSDF to change that object to become a thin sheet. So it could be glass, paper, or any other material depending on the parameters that you're working with. And still speaking about nodes, we've got a new time node that has been added, and this works similarly to what you've got with geometry nodes. And we've also got some nice cool stuff for subsurfacing, as this is also seen in cycles. So within cycles, the subsurface BSDF and subsurface components in the principal BSDF now support negative anisotropy. At the same time, the random walk radius scaling has now been done in such a way to match other renders better. And just to keep compatibility, all the files once they get opened automatically converted to use random walk legacy mode. Something else which is really good is the texture caching. We did mention this as part of the project that we're working on, and it makes a lot of sense to see how this has evolved. And the cache texture, which is the TX file, is simply optimized to load just the tile and resolution needed for rendering at a specific time. And this can be automatically updated when the image file is modified. Of course, you can take a look at the performance and statistics to get an idea of how the texture cache impacts on memory and also render time. And this also talks about how you can generate the TX file and work with them. OpenShader language is also having updates to it, and the raycast attribute also has some updates. And for updates about raycast can be seen within EEVEe and the viewport. And this is where the screen space raycasting overhaul actually comes to play. So for those who like to read up on all of these and check out most of these features that are now here, links to this is going to be in the description, so do well to check it out. For those who like to find out amazing cool add-ons that they can work with, links to that is also going to be in the description. And currently the folks at Superhive are celebrating 12 years and they're offering this massive bundle with tons of cool features. So for those who like to grab that one, links to this is going to be in the description, so do well to check it out. And speaking about things that you can grab, the folks at Renderhub currently have a ton of free 3D models that you can work with. So if you're looking for amazing 3D models that you can use for your next project, then of course you should definitely consider checking out Renderhub, where you'll be able to find a ton of these. At the same time, if you're looking for more 3D models that you can purchase via the marketplace, there's also a lot of these. At the same time, you'll be able to find both rig model, game ready model, animated model, PBR materials, and so on. And if you're looking for inspiration, the 3D Art Gallery has a ton of inspiring works that can get you going. So depending on what you're trying to create, you will definitely find something that can get you inspired right here. And speaking about creating, the folks at Renderhub has recently launched the Sexy Robot Contest version 3. And this comes with a prize pool of $5,550. This is running from April the 15th to June the 30th of 2026. And of course, for those who like to read up about deliverables, I'm going to link this one in the description. More so, the winners will be announced on the 14th of July of 2026. So this is it for those who like to find amazing 3D models, or maybe you like to buy or sell your very own 3D model, or potentially you're looking for inspiration, then Renderhub is the home for you. Tell me what you guys think about this one in the comment section, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.